You really think a man like Julian built all this on his own?
He works hard, that's not nothing.
Hard work doesn't explain the accounts, the house, all of it sitting right there. You've earned your share of this. More than your share.
We'd have to be careful about how we move things.
I've done this before. Nothing that trips a flag. By the time he notices anything, you'll already be out. He'll never see it coming.
Gavin said it like it was already done. Like the house, the accounts, the 8 years I'd spent building something real were just assets sitting on a table waiting to be divided by someone who'd never earned a single dollar of it. I wasn't nervous. That was the part I kept coming back to. A man helping my wife quietly drain our joint accounts, and he spoke about it the way someone orders lunch. What Gavin didn't know, what neither of them knew, was how long I'd actually been paying attention, and the question wasn't whether I'd find out. The question was what I'd already found. If stories like this one stay with you, consider subscribing. There's more where this came from, and I think you'll want to be here for it. The trip to Denver was supposed to last 4 days. I'd made that drive from the airport to our house on Lake Corbin. So many times that I could do it without thinking the exit off the highway. The left turn past the gas station. The long curve where the tree line opens up and you can see the water for the first time. I knew every mile of it. What I didn't know, driving home 36 hours early with nothing but a canceled meeting and a quiet car, was that the house I was heading back to wasn't the one I thought I'd left. The client had pulled out without warning. Some internal issue they wouldn't explain over the phone, just a terse email saying they needed to reschedule and they'd be in touch. I'd already checked out of the hotel by the time I read it. I stood in the lobby with my bag at my feet and looked at my phone for a long moment. The obvious thing was to call Mare and tell her I was coming home early, let her know she didn't need to plan around my absence for the next 2 days. I opened her contact, then I closed it. I told myself I wanted to surprise her, that we could use an unexpected evening together, no agenda, just time. What I didn't examine too closely was why the idea of calling ahead felt like something I didn't want to do. I sat in the Denver airport for 2 hours waiting for the rescheduled flight. At some point, I found myself thinking about a Saturday the previous October, about 10 months before that evening. We'd driven out to a farm stand about 40 minutes from Greystone, bought too many apples, come home and made something that was meant to be a pie and ended up being more of a cobbler because neither of us knew what we were doing. Marin had laughed so hard at the end result that she'd had to sit down. I hadn't thought about that afternoon in months. I wasn't sure why it came back to me then in a plastic airport chair with a lukewarm coffee, except that it felt like the last time I'd known with certainty that we were okay. That was the version of us I was driving home to find. That was what I told myself. I'd been thinking about us a lot on that trip. Not in a worried way, or at least that's what I told myself. More like a man who looks up from his desk after too many hours and realizes the room has gotten dark without him noticing. Marin and I had been off for a while. Not fighting, not anything dramatic, just quieter than we used to be. She'd started working later, coming home with her phone already in her bag screened down. She'd snap at me sometimes when I asked about her week, like the question itself was an intrusion. I'd chalked it up to stress. Her studio had taken on bigger clients, more moving pieces, more pressure. I told myself that was all it was. What I hadn't told myself, what I kept pushing to the edge of my thinking, was that she'd stopped reaching for me first. Not just physically. She used to text me random things in the middle of the day. A photo of a coffee she thought looked like a face. A complaint about traffic. Just noise, the kind of noise that means someone is thinking about you even when they don't have a reason to be. That had stopped maybe 8 or 9 months ago, and I hadn't let myself look directly at what that meant. So I drove home. The roads were clear. I made good time. By the time I turned onto our street, it was late afternoon. The light going orange over the water, the kind of evening that looks like a photograph of itself. Myron's car was in this garage. I pulled in beside it and sat there for a moment thinking about how I'd walk in, what I'd say, whether I'd suggest we open a bottle of something and sit out by the lake. I was trying to build a good moment out of a ruined week. I had my key in the door before I noticed anything wrong. The kitchen was the first room I walked through, and I almost kept moving. Almost. But something snagged my attention without announcing itself the way a smell does before you've placed it. There were 2 glasses on the counter. A bottle of Bordeaux already opened, about a third of it gone. 2 plates with the remains of a meal that hadn't been cleared. None of that was impossible on its own. Marin had friends who came over for dinner sometimes, and she didn't always text me about it. But then I saw the watch. It was sitting at the edge of the counter near the fruit bowl, like someone had taken it off casually and set it down without thinking. A man's watch silver case leather band. And on the back, catching the light at the angle, I was standing a small scratch in the shape of a rough X. I'd seen that scratch before. 3 weeks earlier, Marin had sent me a photo of the living room while I was in Chicago. Some new throw pillows she wanted my opinion on, which she'd never particularly cared about before. I remember scrolling past the image, quickly distracted, but something had registered in the glass of the door to the backyard. A reflection. I hadn't thought about it again until this moment, standing in my own kitchen with my bag still on my shoulder. I set my bag down. I went upstairs. The door to our bedroom was not fully closed. I could see the stripe of light from the gap at the bottom. I pushed it open slowly, not because I was trying to be quiet, but because some part of me already knew what I was about to see and was still searching for another few seconds where I didn't know it yet. The man in our bed was on his back, the blanket pulled up to his chest, completely still. He looked about 40, maybe a few years older than me. His shirt was on the floor. His shoes were neatly placed beside the dresser, which somehow made it worse. There was something deliberate about those shoes. Like he'd been here before and he knew where to put things. I didn't move. I stood in the doorway and looked at the room I'd slept in for 8 years, and it looked completely foreign to me. My brain kept trying to find an exit, some version of events where this was explainable, where there was a sentence someone could say that would make the shoes and the shirt and the man in the bed cohere into something other than what they obviously were. We'd bought that bed in the first year we lived in the house. Marin had spent 45 minutes in the showroom deciding between 2 options that looked identical to me. I'd stood there holding both headboard samples, and she'd finally laughed and said she couldn't tell the difference either. That was the bed. That was the room. And the man in it was not me. Then the sound of running water stopped. The bathroom door opened. Marin stepped out with a towel around her hair, wearing a robe, not yet looking up. When she did, her face went through several expressions in a single second. I watched all of them. Shock first, then something that looked like calculation. Then finally what I think she decided would be most useful, distress. The man in the bed stirred when she made a small sound. He sat up, and for a moment the 3 of us were in the same room with nobody speaking. His name, I'd learn in the next few minutes, was Gavin Rourke. He was introduced by Marin in clipped, nervous sentences, a developer she'd met through a work event, someone she'd been in contact with about a potential business project. She said it the way people say things when they're trying to make something sound smaller than it is. Gavin said nothing. He collected his shirt from the floor with the practiced efficiency of a man who understood that the less he contributed to this moment, the cleaner his exit would be. Marin was the first to find real words. She said she could explain. She said it in the tone people use when they don't yet have the explanation ready, but need to buy themselves time to find one. I looked at her for a long moment, and then I asked the only question that felt worth asking: how long? She didn't answer. Gavin was already getting out of bed, putting on his shoes, the same shoes that had been placed so deliberately beside the dresser. He kept his eyes down and moved toward the door. I had every reason to stop him. There was something animal in me that wanted to. But I thought about what it would look like, not to anyone outside that room, but to me. If I made this into something loud and physical, I would be handing Marin the only version of events where she got to be something other than the person who did this. She could reframe it. She could use whatever happened in the next 5 minutes to shift the weight of the moment off herself and onto me. I didn't give her that. I picked up my keys from where I'd set them on the dresser. Before I walked out, I looked at her and said that I needed to know the full truth before I listened to any explanation. Not a question. Not a threat. Just a sentence that closed the door on whatever performance she was preparing. I drove without a destination and ended up in the parking lot of a hardware store about 2 miles from our neighborhood, engine running, looking at nothing. The lot was mostly empty. A man was loading bags of mulch into a pickup truck 2 spaces over, moving slowly in no hurry. I watched him finish and drive away, and then I was alone in the lot with the engine idling and nothing to look at. I started going back through the past year, not looking for the moment it started. I wasn't sure I could identify that even if I tried, but taking inventory. The evenings she'd said she was working late and I hadn't questioned it because her studio was genuinely busy and I was genuinely distracted. The weekend in March when she'd gone to visit a friend in Asheville and come back quieter than she'd left, and I'd assumed the drive tired her. The way she'd started closing the bathroom door to take calls, which I'd noticed and then unfiled categorized as nothing. There were a dozen moments like that, maybe more. None of them had been enough on their own. Together they made a picture I'd been choosing not to see. What struck me sitting in that parking lot was that I wasn't angry the way I expected to be. There was anger in there somewhere, but it was underneath something colder and more functional. The particular clarity that arrives when you finally stop trying to make the evidence fit the story you prefer. I thought about Marin's face in the bedroom doorway. Not the distress, which I didn't trust. The calculation which came before it and which lasted only a second before she decided it wasn't useful. That second told me more than the crying had. My phone buzzed. I looked at it, a work email I didn't read. And then I opened my contacts and called Maribel Knox, who had been my business attorney for over a decade and had seen me through contract disputes and a partnership restructuring and one genuinely ugly non-compete situation. She picked up on the third ring. I told her I needed a divorce attorney, that evening if possible. She didn't ask me why. She said she knew someone good and she'd make a call. By the time I drove back, the house was quiet. Gavin's car, which I now realized had been parked 2 streets over, was gone. Marin was sitting in the kitchen. She had changed her clothes, and I noticed immediately that the old bed sheets were folded on the laundry room shelf. Through the open door. She had stripped the bed and remade it while I was gone, like that was a thing that would help. She started talking almost as soon as I came through the door. She said it had only been 4 months. She said she'd been lonely, that I was always somewhere else, always half present, even when I was physically in the room, and that Gavin had made her feel like she existed in a way she hadn't felt in years. She was crying by the time she got to that part. She said she still loved me. She asked if we could try therapy. She said this didn't have to be the end of everything. I was listening, and there was a part of me that was absorbing everything she said and weighing it seriously. 8 years is not nothing. I knew that. I wasn't going to pretend this was simple. And then she said it had been the first time Gavin had ever come to the house. She said it naturally, without emphasis, tucked into the middle of a longer sentence about boundaries and mistakes. But it landed wrong. I thought about the watch. I thought about the reflection I'd seen in the glass door of that photograph 3 weeks before this night. I thought about the way those shoes had been placed beside the dresser. Not the shoes of a man in an unfamiliar room, but the shoes of a man who knew which side of the room the dresser was on. She was still talking. I let her finish. I didn't call her a liar that night. I didn't present what I knew. I just told her I needed some time to think, went to the guest room, and lay on top of the covers in the dark with my phone on my chest, staring at the ceiling. The next morning, I called Maribel back. She'd already spoken to her contact and gave me the name of a divorce attorney named Patricia Hale, who specialized in high-asset dissolutions and was, Maribel said, extremely good at finding the parts of a financial picture that someone had tried to keep hidden. It was Patricia who connected me with Tessa Langford, a forensic accountant with 20 years of experience reading the financial history of a marriage, the way a doctor reads an X-ray looking for the places where something didn't line up. I gave Tessa access to everything I had. Joint accounts, shared investment portfolios, the mortgage documents on the Lake Corbin House, Marin's business accounts, to the extent they intersected with shared assets. Then I waited. What Tessa found in the following days changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about the previous year of my life. Marin had not known Gavin for 4 months. Their communication records pulled through financial transaction links and business registration documents that Tessa traced through public filings showed contact going back nearly 11 months. Gavin was not just someone Marin had fallen into something with at a vulnerable moment. He was a developer with a specific kind of business model, small hospitality ventures, boutique resort properties, the kind of projects that needed a particular type of investor who could move money in increments that didn't attract immediate attention and who had a personal reason to keep the whole arrangement quiet. The company was called North Vale Hospitality Group. The paperwork was real. Tessa found the registration documents, the preliminary operating agreement, the projected capital structure. Marin's intended contribution was listed at just under $186,000. The problem was that Marin didn't have $186,000 in liquid personal assets. What she did have was access to our joint investment accounts. Tessa laid it out for me over a phone call that I took sitting in my car in the office parking garage because I didn't want anyone to see my face while I listened. Over 8 months, Marin had moved money out of 3 different shared accounts in transfers ranging from $4,000 to $18,000, none of them large enough individually to trigger scrutiny, but collectively adding up to $173,400. I sat with the phone against my ear and didn't say anything for a long time after Tessa stopped talking. She waited. She'd clearly delivered news like this before and knew how long it took to settle. What I kept returning to was the timeline. 8 months of small, careful transfers. 11 months of contact with Gavin. All of it running underneath the surface of a marriage that from the outside looked like it was simply drifting. That was the story I'd been living inside. What Marin had actually been doing was building a door and quietly saving up enough to walk through it. I drove home that night and sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while. The watch was gone from the counter. Everything looked exactly the way it always had. Same house, same lake out the window, same kitchen where we'd eaten 1,000 dinners. It was the same house. I just finally understood what had been happening inside it. The days after Tessa's phone call had a strange quality to them. I was still sleeping in the guest room. Marin and I moved around each other in the house like 2 people sharing a waiting room, careful and quiet, neither of us ready to say out loud what we both already knew was coming. She'd stopped trying to explain things. I think she sensed that the conversation had shifted into territory where explanations weren't going to be enough, even if she didn't know exactly how much I'd already learned. Patricia Hale was methodical in a way I found steadying. She didn't dramatize anything. She laid out the legal landscape the way an engineer describes a load-bearing wall. Here is what exists. Here is what it means. Here is what happens if you remove it. She told me that given the asset structure of the marriage, we were looking at a contested process. There would be discovery, there would be negotiation, and she said I should make sure I didn't do anything in the interim that could be used to reframe the narrative. She also said she needed Tessa to complete her full documentation before we filed anything so that our picture of the finances was airtight going in. That meant more waiting, more mornings in the same house. Living in the same space as someone who had spent the better part of a year quietly dismantling your shared life and being asked to act as though you didn't know that required a kind of sustained composure I hadn't known I was capable of. I went to work. I came home. I made coffee in the morning and left a cup on the counter for Marin because that was what I'd always done, and stopping would have signaled something. I was not going to signal anything until Patricia told me it was time. There was a morning about a week in, where Marin was already at the kitchen table when I came downstairs, laptop open, working on something for the studio. We ended up having a conversation about the electric bill. There'd been a discrepancy in the last statement, and she wanted to know if I'd called the provider. I said I hadn't gotten to it. She said she'd handle it. I said fine. We moved around each other for the next few minutes. She refilled her coffee. I found my keys and then I left for the office. The whole exchange lasted maybe 4 minutes, and was completely ordinary in every surface detail. What made it strange was that I was watching it happen from somewhere slightly outside myself, the way you watch a scene in a movie you've already seen. I knew what the house actually was now. I knew what the past year had actually been. And yet there we were talking about the electric bill. I noticed things about Marin differently during those days. Not with anger exactly. The anger was there, but it had settled into something quieter and more observational. I watched the way she held her phone when she was in the kitchen, slightly angled away from the room, even when I wasn't nearby. I watched the way she answered questions about her schedule with just enough detail to be plausible and not enough to be verifiable. I'd seen these habits for months without naming them. Now I could name them clearly, and what surprised me was how ordinary they looked once you understood what they were. She wasn't careless or obvious. She was practiced. That was its own kind of information. One evening, I was in the living room with a work document when I heard her voice from down the hallway. She was on a call and the bedroom door closed, and I couldn't make out words, only tone. It wasn't the tone of someone talking to a client. It was lower, more careful, with the occasional silence that means the other person is talking at length. I didn't move toward the door. I didn't try to listen. I just sat where I was and let the sound register as data rather than provocation. And after a few minutes it stopped and I went back to the document. Patricia had been clear I was not going to do anything that complicated the process. Whatever Maren was managing on her end was her business until it became evidence, and Tessa would find whatever was findable without me needing to involve myself. It was during one of my working sessions with Tessa that the name Rourke came up in a different context. She had been tracing the corporate structure around North Vale Hospitality Group and found a parent entity, a small holding company called Rourke Capital Partners. She mentioned it briefly, flagged it in her notes, and moved on to the more immediate questions. A few days later, I was at Patricia's office going through preliminary asset disclosures when I mentioned Gavin's full name in passing. One of the associates in the room, someone who handled document preparation and had been with the firm for several years, looked up briefly and said she thought she recognized the name from a contract dispute she'd helped with about 2 years earlier, something involving a company with a similar name. She didn't go further than that, said she couldn't discuss the details, and went back to her paperwork. It was 5 seconds at most, and I filed it away without fully understanding why. What I understood was that Gavin Rourke had a history, and that Maren was not the first person to have encountered the shape of his operation. The financial picture Tessa assembled by the end of that period was more complete than I'd expected, and worse than I'd allowed myself to anticipate. The $173,400 in transferred funds was the part I'd already processed. What I hadn't yet confronted was the house itself. Patricia brought it to me in person, which I later realized was her way of managing the moment. She said there was a complication with the Lake Corbin property, and she wanted to walk me through it before we got too far into the filing process. 4 years earlier, when Maren and I had refinanced the house to fund a renovation, new kitchen, additional outdoor deck, some structural work, the inspector had flagged, I'd signed a stack of documents over the course of 2 days while simultaneously managing one of the larger client negotiations my company had ever handled. I remembered the signing. I remembered sitting across from the title agent with a pen in one hand and my phone in the other, scrolling through emails between signatures, and Maren sitting next to me going through her own copies. I'd assumed we were reading the same thing. It turned out she may have read more carefully than I had. Patricia laid out what I'd actually signed, and it turned out the ownership structure of the property had been modified in ways I hadn't caught. Maren held a significantly larger legal interest in the house than I'd understood her to have. I asked Patricia the question directly: in the worst case, would I have to leave the house? She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the documents in front of her for a moment, and then she said that the most likely outcome was a sale with proceeds divided according to the established ownership structure. She said it in the careful, even tone of someone who has learned to deliver bad news without the delivery itself becoming the issue. I understood what she was telling me. The house I'd put the majority of the down payment on, the house I'd planned to grow old in, was going to be sold and the proceeds split. And I was going to have to sit with that while we spent the next several months making it happen. There was something else. A home equity line of credit had been opened against the property. I had a vague memory of it being discussed as a financial buffer, something responsible to have available, and Maren had drawn from it. $92,000 pulled out in several withdrawals over a period of months, and Tessa's tracing suggested a portion of it had moved toward accounts connected to North Vale Hospitality Group. I sat in Patricia's office and felt something I hadn't quite felt before in this process. Not anger, not grief exactly, but a kind of bone-level fatigue. Like the floor had been giving way slowly for months, and I'd only just noticed I was standing on air. I asked Patricia what we needed to do next. She told me. I wrote it down. The harder thing to sit with was the discovery that Maren had consulted a divorce attorney of her own 3 months before I'd come home early from Denver. She had not filed anything, but she'd gone in, she'd had the conversation, she'd understood what her position would look like. What she'd communicated in that consultation was a version of our marriage I recognized only in outline. I worked too much, true. I was emotionally unavailable, arguable, and I'd argued it with myself. I was controlling about finances, which carried a particular kind of irony given what Tessa had found. The portrait she'd drawn was of a woman who had been trying to hold a difficult marriage together against the resistance of a husband who prioritized everything else. And the thing that made it genuinely hard to process was that some of the ingredients were real. She hadn't invented a character from nothing. I did work too much. There were conversations I kept deferring, problems I kept assuming would resolve themselves if given enough time. There were specific moments I could recall now. A birthday dinner I'd cut short for a call, a weekend trip we'd planned, and I'd canceled twice that she had clearly filed away, and I had let go of as isolated incidents rather than a pattern. But I kept coming back to one thing. She had not brought any of this to me. Not once in all the months she was apparently building this case in her own mind had she sat down and said, "This is what I need from you, and if it doesn't change, I'm done." There had been complaints, yes. There had been the kind of low-grade friction that long marriages accumulate. But there had never been a moment where she looked me in the eye and said we were in real trouble, that she was seriously considering leaving, that something needed to fundamentally change. Instead, she had taken those legitimate grievances and used them as the foundation for a narrative she was constructing for an exit she had already decided on. She'd been building her case while still living inside the marriage, and I'd been trying to figure out how to be better at a game that had already ended. I thought about the therapy she'd proposed the night I came home. She'd said it with real feeling, or something that looked like real feeling, and I'd almost let it move me. Now I understood it differently. By that point, she'd already been to her own attorney. She'd already moved over $170,000. She'd already been planning a business with Gavin for the better part of a year. The offer of therapy wasn't a bid to save the marriage. It was a move in a sequence that had started long before I walked through the bedroom door. I couldn't be cleanly angry about any of it, and that was the part that took the most time to sit with, because the anger was there, but it kept running up against the parts that were genuinely complicated. She hadn't been happy. I believed that. The marriage had real problems that I had real responsibility for. I knew that too. What I couldn't accept, what I kept coming back to, was that she had never given me the chance to know how serious it was. She had decided the answer and then built the question around it, and she had done it carefully over months while I was still in it. It was about 10 days into this arrangement on a Thursday evening that I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. I was at my desk finishing a proposal, and the unfamiliar number looked like a sales call. I picked up anyway, some instinct I couldn't name overriding the habit of ignoring unknown numbers after 8 in the evening. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Brielle Rourke. She said she was Gavin's younger sister and that she handled accounting for part of the family's business operation. Her voice was careful in the way of someone who'd rehearsed the beginning of this conversation but wasn't sure where it would go. She said she'd found transactions in the books she couldn't reconcile against actual assets. When she'd confronted Gavin, he'd deflected, which had only made her look harder. She'd found his name connected to multiple investment arrangements with structures nearly identical to each other, all of them involving properties he had no documented controlling interest in. She'd found my name as an affiliated party through Marin's involvement in North Vale Hospitality Group, and she was calling because she needed to know whether someone else had already seen what she was seeing, and because one of the other people Gavin was soliciting was someone in her own extended circle. She wasn't calling out of loyalty to me. She was calling because she needed a witness to what she'd found, and I was the most logical person to be that witness. I thanked her. I told her to document everything she had and send it to me in writing, and that I would be speaking with my attorney. After we hung up, I sat at my desk for a long time without touching the proposal. Outside the window, the lake was dark and flat and very still. What I understood now, with Brielle's call settling into the rest of what I knew, was the full geometry of what had happened. Gavin had not fallen in love with my wife. He had found a woman who was unhappy inside a marriage that came with substantial shared assets, and he had made himself into the answer to that unhappiness with the specific intention of accessing those assets. The loneliness Marin felt was real. Her dissatisfaction with our marriage was real. Gavin had used both of those real things as a door, and he had walked through it with a clear sense of what was on the other side. Marin had thought she was choosing her future. She had actually been chosen because of what she could provide access to. I didn't feel satisfaction about that. What I felt was something closer to a quiet, specific grief, not for the marriage which I had already let go of in every way that mattered, but for the fact that the woman I'd spent 8 years with had been deceived by the same person she'd deceived me for. That was its own particular kind of waste. I went to bed that night without having decided what to do with what I knew. I lay in the dark in the guest room and let the question sit without trying to resolve it. There are things you can reason your way to, and there are things that only become clear when you stop reasoning and just wait for the answer to surface on its own. By morning, without having consciously worked through it, I knew what I was going to do. Not because I'd calculated it, but because I understood something about the kind of person I was and wasn't, and the answer followed from that without any particular effort. What Maren had done to me was finished. What happened to her next was still in motion. And I was not willing to be someone who watched a person get hurt and said nothing because they had it coming. I forwarded Brielle's contact information to Patricia the following morning. Patricia said she'd loop in Tessa to cross-reference whatever documents Brielle was willing to share against what we'd already assembled. By that point, Tessa had finished her core documentation. The asset transfers were fully mapped, the home equity withdrawals were on record, and the connection between Maren's moved funds and the North Vale accounts had been established clearly enough to withstand scrutiny. Patricia said we were in a strong position to file, but that there was one more thing she wanted me to consider before we moved forward. She said that if Gavin was running a broader scheme and Maren was one of multiple targets, that context could affect how a court viewed the asset transfers, not necessarily to Maren's benefit, but it complicated the picture in ways we needed to understand. She wasn't telling me what to do with the information about Gavin. She was making sure I went into whatever came next with open eyes. I told her I was considering warning Maren directly. There was a brief quiet on the line. Patricia said that was my decision, not hers, but she wanted me to know that Tessa's work was complete and that from a legal standpoint, we were ready either way. The financial picture was already documented. Whatever Maren did with a warning wouldn't change what was on paper. The question I kept returning to that night was not strategic. It was simpler. If someone had information that would protect me from being defrauded and they chose not to share it because they thought I deserved what was coming, what would I think of that person? The answer was obvious. And it didn't change just because I was now on the other side of it. I waited until the following evening to approach Maren. She was in the living room with her laptop, the lake visible through the glass behind her. I sat down across from her and told her there was something she needed to hear and that I needed her to listen without interrupting until I'd finished. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, wary, and something underneath the wariness that might have been hope, though I think even she knew by then that hope was probably not the right thing to feel about whatever I was about to say. I told her about Brielle's call. I told her what Brielle had found in the books, the transactions that didn't reconcile the parallel investment structures, the properties that Gavin had described as acquisition targets but held no documented interest in. I told her that as far as the available evidence suggested, the business she believed she was building with him was not real. Maren's face went through something complicated while I was talking. I watched her process it in pieces, each sentence landing separately. When I finished, she said she didn't believe me. Then before I could respond, she said something I hadn't expected. She said Brielle had always had issues with Gavin, that he'd mentioned family tension around the business, that his sister had a pattern of inserting herself into his professional dealings when things weren't going her way. She said it quickly, like she'd heard the explanation before, which I realized she probably had. Gavin had preloaded that defense. He'd known Brielle might eventually look too closely at the books, and he'd seeded Maren with a reason to discount whatever she found. I told Maren that. I said it as plainly as I could, that a man who prepares an excuse for his accuser before the accusation arrives is a man who already knows the accusation is coming. She didn't answer that directly. Instead, she said Gavin had shown her the properties that she'd seen photographs and site assessments and preliminary development plans. I told her that photographs and documents were not the same as ownership, and that if she asked him for signed option agreements or proof of any binding purchase arrangement, and he produced them, she'd know I was wrong. And if he didn't produce them, she'd know something else. I told her to ask for specifics, title search results, executed contracts, proof of any deposit held in escrow. things that either existed or didn't. She said she would need to talk to Gavin herself. I told her that was exactly what she should do. I got up and went back upstairs. I didn't know what she would do with what I'd told her. I hadn't given it to her as a peace offering or as a way of reopening something that was already closed. I'd given it to her because it was the right thing to do, and because I had decided somewhere in the long quiet of those weeks in the guest room that I was not going to let what Maren had done to me determine what I was willing to do for another person. The following days were quiet in a way that felt different from the quiet that had settled over the house in the weeks prior. Maren was on her phone more than usual, but not in the careful, angled way of someone managing a secret. This was the visible urgency of someone trying to get answers and not getting them. I didn't ask. I went to work, came home, continued the routine Patricia had advised me to maintain. On the 5th day, Maren knocked on the guest room door in the evening. She stood in the doorway rather than entering, one hand on the frame, and she looked like she hadn't slept well in several days. She said she'd called Gavin 4 times. He'd taken the first 2 calls and given her explanations she'd initially accepted, then gone quiet after she asked for the specific documentation I'd told her to request. She'd gone to the apartment where they'd usually met, and the building manager told her he'd vacated 10 days ago. His phone now went straight to voicemail. She stood in the doorway of the guest room and said very quietly that she understood I'd been telling her the truth. I didn't say I told you so. There was nothing to gain from it. What I said was that she should get her own legal counsel immediately and document every communication she'd had with Gavin and every transaction she'd made in connection with North Vale Hospitality Group, because she was going to need all of it. She asked me why I'd told her. She said it plainly, not as an accusation, but as a genuine question after everything, why. I told her that what she'd chosen to do didn't get to decide who I chose to be. She looked at me for a long moment, trying to determine whether I'd prepared that or whether I actually meant it. I meant it. I'd been living with the idea of it long enough that it had become something solid. She said she thought it meant I still wanted to try. I told her as directly and as kindly as I could that warning her about Gavin and continuing our marriage were 2 completely separate things, and that the divorce was going forward. She didn't argue. She nodded and stepped back from the doorway and went down the hall. Patricia filed the divorce petition the following week. What came next was 5 months of the particular exhaustion that comes with contested legal proceedings. Not dramatic, not explosive, just grinding and relentless. There were depositions, financial disclosures, back and forth negotiations over assets I had once thought were simply mine because I'd built them. There was an afternoon mediation session about 3 months in where I sat across a conference table from Maren and her attorney, and I watched Maren present her account of the marriage with the same careful structure I'd read about in the consultation notes. She was composed and specific, and she said things that were partially true in ways that made the partial truth sound like the whole picture. I listened to all of it without interrupting, and what I noticed was that I wasn't angry sitting there. I was tired in a very specific way. The tiredness of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and can see the place where they're going to be able to set it down, but isn't there yet. The money that had left the joint accounts was documented. The home equity withdrawals were on record. The connection between Maren's transferred funds and the North Vale accounts was established clearly enough that there wasn't much room for creative reinterpretation on her side, though her attorney tried several angles before dropping them. The house was the hardest negotiation. Maren's legal interest was real, whatever the circumstances surrounding how the ownership structure had gotten arranged. There were a few weeks where the numbers suggested a scenario in which I could buy out her interest and keep the property. I ran those numbers several times, and there was a version of me that wanted to make them work, not because I needed the house, but because letting it go felt like conceding something I didn't want to concede. I recognized that feeling for what it was. It wasn't about the house. It was about not wanting the person who had done all of this to walk away with anything. And that was not a good enough reason to anchor myself to 4 walls and a view of a lake that I would have to look at every morning while rebuilding everything else. One evening during that stretch, I drove to the townhouse in Belmere where I'd already put down a deposit. I'd been staying in a short-term rental nearby but had started transitioning my things. The movers had brought the first load that afternoon, and the place was half filled with boxes I hadn't unpacked yet. I sat down on the floor because there was no furniture in the main room yet back against the wall, and I stayed there for a while just taking stock. It was the first time in months that I was somewhere with no history attached to it. No memories embedded in the walls, no associations I had to consciously set aside. It was just a room. A small room with decent light and a window that looked out onto a street I was just beginning to learn. The feeling that came with that wasn't happiness exactly. But it wasn't pain either. It was something more neutral and more honest, the particular sensation of a reset, where you're not yet sure what you're building, but you're sure the clearing has happened. I called Patricia from the floor of that empty room and told her we could proceed with the sale of the Lake Corbin house. I went there one final time on a weekday afternoon to collect the last of what was mine. A few things from the study, some boxes from the basement. Maren had already moved out. The house was empty and very clean the way houses get when they've been prepared for strangers. I walked through each room without any particular plan. The kitchen where I'd seen the wine glasses and the plates and the watch. The living room with the view of Lake Corbin that had been the reason we'd wanted the house in the first place. I went upstairs and stood in the doorway of the bedroom, just a room now, empty walls, bare floors, afternoon light coming through the windows at the same angle it always had. I stood there and understood something I hadn't quite articulated before. I wasn't going to miss the house. I was going to miss the version of my life I'd believed I was building inside it. Those were different things, and it mattered to know the difference. I locked the door and gave the key to the real estate agent waiting in the driveway. The townhouse in Belmere became mine in the way places do when you stop treating them as temporary. I hung a few things on the walls. I learned which coffee shop around the corner opened earliest. I had my brother over for dinner, and we ate takeout on the couch and watched something neither of us could remember afterward, and it was the most normal evening I'd had in longer than I could calculate. Normal, it turned out, was something I'd undervalued for a long time. Maren's studio survived reduced in scale. I heard this through a peripheral connection, not through any direct communication. The business she'd been trying to build with Gavin did not survive because there was nothing to survive. Whatever money she'd moved in his direction before everything came apart was largely gone. Gavin himself did not resurface in any way that crossed my line of sight. Brielle had turned over her documentation to an attorney of her own, and there was some indication that the other investors Gavin had been working were building their own cases. What happened with that, I did not follow closely. I had enough to manage without tracking outcomes that didn't directly involve me. Several months after the divorce was finalized, I came home from work on a Wednesday evening to find a letter in my mailbox with Maren's handwriting on the envelope. I brought it inside and looked at it for a while before opening it. Not because I was afraid of it, but because I wanted to go in without any particular expectation of what I was going to feel. It was 2 pages handwritten. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't try to reopen the question of what we'd been to each other. What she wrote, as plainly as I'd ever heard her say anything, was that she had spent a long time telling herself a story about our marriage that made her choices feel inevitable, like she'd been pushed to them, like she'd had no real options. She said she understood now that the story wasn't accurate. She said she had known on some level that what she was doing was wrong, and she had built a narrative around it specifically because the alternative was sitting with that knowledge directly. She said she was sorry, not in the vague, all-purpose way people apologize when they want absolution, but in the specific way that names the thing and doesn't try to soften it. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it and put it in the drawer of my nightstand. I didn't write back. Not to punish her. It was that I recognized I didn't need to respond. I had said what I needed to say in that guest room doorway months before. The letter was hers. The silence was mine. And the silence was not empty. It was full of something I hadn't had in a long time, which was the simple, solid understanding that I was done. Not angry. Not waiting for her to feel worse so I could feel better. Just done. That was when I started sleeping well again. The lake house sold the following spring to a family with 2 young kids who'd fallen in love with the water view. The agent mentioned it when she sent the final paperwork. I thought about those kids looking at Lake Corbin for the first time, not knowing anything about what the house had been before it was theirs. That seemed right. That seemed like exactly what a house and maybe a life should be allowed to do. Move forward. Start over. Become something new for someone who needs it. Nearly a year later, I was back at an airport sitting at a gate with a delayed flight and a coffee going cold in my hand. The man in the seat next to me muttered that it was a terrible way to start a trip. I looked at the departures board and found myself smiling just slightly. The last time a business trip got interrupted, I'd driven home to find the floor had dropped out of my life. I'd stood in a bedroom doorway and watched 8 years of what I thought I'd built become something I didn't recognize. And then I'd spent the better part of a year inside a process that was equal parts legal, financial, and personal, all of it happening at once. All of it requiring me to stay functional and clear-headed in a situation that offered plenty of reasons not to be. I looked around the gate. A woman across from me was on the phone laughing about something, one hand pressed to her ear to hear better over the terminal noise. A young couple near the window was sharing a pair of earbuds, heads tilted together toward whatever they were watching. An older man 2 seats down was reading a physical newspaper folded in half, with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested he'd been doing it for decades. Ordinary people in transit moving from one place to another carrying whatever they were carrying. I thought about the last time I'd sat in an airport and called Marin, not because I missed her or had anything particular to say, but because it was what I did when I traveled. It had been a habit, the kind you don't notice you have until you don't have it anymore. Now my phone was in my pocket and the gate was loud and I was not reaching for it. I was fine. I thought about the project I was heading to pitch the following morning, a logistics overhaul for a regional hospital network that had been in early conversations with my company for several months. It was the kind of work I was good at and genuinely interested in, which hadn't always felt like the same thing in the years when I was building the business and grinding through whatever came next, regardless of whether it interested me. Somewhere in the past year, without planning it, I'd gotten more deliberate about that distinction. The flight was still delayed. I finished the cold coffee. I wasn't in a hurry. There's something I've come to believe sitting in that airport, and in the months that led up to it. The hardest thing about being betrayed by someone you trusted isn't the anger. The anger is actually the easy part. It's clean and it has direction. The hard part is what comes after when the anger settles, and you're left with the more complicated work of figuring out who you are without the version of your life you thought you were living. That work doesn't happen all at once. It happens in parking lots at night, in empty rooms with no furniture, in airport terminals with cold coffee and delayed flights. It happens in all the small, unremarkable moments where you discover that you're still standing, and you didn't have to become someone worse to get there. If any part of this story stayed with you, the part about holding on to yourself when you had every reason not to, or the part about what it costs to do the right thing when nobody's watching, then you're exactly who this channel is for. Subscribe if you want to stay. There's more ahead, and I think it'll be worth your time.